In this episode, I am once again joined by Professor Arthur Versluis, Professor and Department Chair of Religious Studies in the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University, and author of over 25 books on subjects ranging from Western esotericism, magic, Christian theosophy, ancient mystery schools, and more. In this episode, we discuss Arthur's 2015 book, American Gurus, and trace the uniquely American cultural and philosophical factors that led to the prevalence of independent spiritual teachers such as Adida, Andrew Cohen, and Ken Wilber. Arthur argues that a philosophy he calls Immediatism is the key cultural force, and traces its origins from Plato to Emerson to the 60s counterculture and beyond. Arthur recounts personal meetings with figures such as Stephen Gaskins, Bill Ayers, and Bernadette Roberts, as well as reflecting on his own affiliation with Tibetan Buddhism as both a practitioner and teacher. Arthur also shares his take on the psychedelic movement, the revolutionary politics of counterculture figures, and the key ingredients of the modern American guru. So, without further ado, Professor Arthur Versluis. Professor Arthur Versluis, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
Well, I'm very delighted to be having a second conversation with you. Our first one some episodes ago proved very popular indeed, discussing Christian Theosophy and your latest book, Conversations in Apocalyptic Times. At this time, I'd like to focus on discussing your book, American Gurus, published by Oxford University Press, From Transcendentalism to New Age Religion. This was published in 2014, and I understand you're currently in the research stages for its sequel.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's a continuation of the themes in that book, and also introducing some new ones, and it's quite exciting. It's a lot of what is going to be in the new book has not ever been written about, or there's only one article that was published in such and such a year. So there's very little on some of the things that I'm writing about in this coming book, which will come out in 2023.
I'm very fascinated in the 6 years that have elapsed since you published American Gurus. I'm very fascinated in the developments that you've charted or observed. Maybe we'll hint at some of them towards the end. But anyway, in American Gurus, you trace a movement or a way of thinking you describe as Immediatism. And you show how Immediatism comes as a sort of blend of Platonism, Romanticism, Transcendentalism, and emerges as sort of uniquely American cultural philosophy, in a sense. And you trace that very specifically through the 60s into the emergence of what you call the American Gurus, figures such as Adida and Andrew Cohen, even figures like Ken Wilber and so on. So I'm wondering, could you lay out your description of an argument for Immediatism? And can you trace its history a little bit in American thought and culture from those early sources to what we're seeing in the present day?
Sure. When you look at the arc of American history and culture, really, and Harold Bloom is someone who suggested this. He argued this some time ago, and I think it's quite true that you have a origin point with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson, Bloom says, is a really important figure. And arguably, you could even say that there's before and after Emerson in terms of American culture. And I think that's true. Of course, Emerson was part of a movement of friends of his, which they really were, like Henry David Thoreau, a whole group of them ultimately, although originally it was really just a few. Bronson Alcott, who was a remarkable figure that I discuss in the book also. Those three together were Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Bronson Alcott were all close. They all lived together near Boston. They all They all shared a real fascination with Asian religions. And Emerson writes in his very early work about the importance of the possibility of us as human beings, as he says, as he puts it, leaping into the throne at once. At once leaping into the throne, meaning that spiritual knowledge is immediately accessible to us if we are open to it, essentially. And that's really actually the origin of the name transcendentalism, which is a kind of cumbersome term that they didn't choose for themselves. It was applied to them. And really what they shared was this immediate spirituality in nature. And that's true especially of Emerson and Thoreau. Eckart was a little bit different, not a lot. And some argued that actually Eckart functioned more or less as Emerson's guru figure, as his guide. And I think there's also truth to that. Eckart was the most remarkable figure given his obscurity, because he today is largely forgotten, but he, like Emerson and like Thoreau, really did have and chronicle spiritual experiences. Emerson wrote about an experience he had on an ordinary day. It was a cloudy day. He was out for a walk, and on that day, he had this sudden intuition. Experience isn't really the right word either. It's this awareness that he had, which he describes. And one of my colleagues, a German colleague named Herwig Friedel, he argued that we actually know more about Emerson's mystical experience than we do about Meister Eckart, the greatest mystic in the German tradition, which is kind of funny, but it is true. In that Emerson was quite open about personal experience, whereas Eckart was much more, he wasn't so much personal. He didn't personalize it. It was simply his sermons. So that's the origin point, I would say, for the tradition that I'm talking about in the book, writing about in the book.
Yeah, I'm very curious also on the aspects of Platonism and Romanticism, that if you could touch on those. And also this, I think a key to the argument you make in the book is the Protestant principle, as you call it, of the individual over the corporate. These sorts of themes that flow in there. But I have another question before that one, which is one of the commonalities with a lot of the figures you describe, right from Ralph Waldo Emerson all the way up to Eckhart Tolle, is a willingness or an openness to write about their personal mystical or spiritual experiences, a sense of inspiration or significance. They evidently consider them something worth writing about, and worth orienting around. And I'm wondering if you've thought about where that sense of the, I suppose, elevation of that subjective individual mystical experience comes from. It's not something that's shared by all the mystics that we're aware of throughout the history of the world. And in fact, there seems to also be a sort of counter culture of a sort of modesty or a hiding away of one's mystical experiences or not speaking of them. We see that, I think, in many of the mystical traditions. It's perhaps even a more mainline view. From where do you think this willingness or fascination with one's own mystical experiences comes from? I think it's something we still see very commonly today.
That's true. And if you look back at the history, the American cultural development in the 18th and 19th centuries, politically, it is decentralized. It's actually a decentralized um, political system where the autonomy of the individual is emphasized, and the political system, federal. Most people today think federal means a giant federal government, because that's how the term. But actually, federalism doesn't mean that at all. It's the exact opposite of that. The American system is federal in the sense it's federated, meaning that power is devolved to originally, and this is the Bill of Rights, the individual. So all rights are held by individuals unless they're enumerated, and herein enumerated. And so that's a very different ethos, you could say. And so that is part of something that Jacob Needleman refers to as the American, the American spirit, you could say, which is it tends to be individualized. And I think that's a really enduring principle. And it's true even today, although it's increasingly, I think, both forgotten and a kind of becoming almost a minority opinion. But there really is something fundamentally American, in my opinion. There really is a kind of American spirit, and part of what the book elucidates is one strand of that. Some of my work is more politically, looking more at political work or political thinking. But here, when you're looking at religion, as Harold Bloom said, Harold Bloom actually argued there's an American religion, as it were. And I think that's true as well in this kind of meta sense that I'm talking about, this kind of meta level. And the figures that I alluded to early on in the book share some things with later figures. And you can really clearly see that. And sometimes the later figures don't acknowledge and even reject the earlier ones. But still, you look at it objectively and you say, well, too bad, because it's actually, there's a continuity there. I'm thinking here of Bernadette Roberts. Bernadette Roberts is a contemporary writer. I know her. She lives in California. And she had a series of experiences which she referred to as no self, and she was actually connected to a Buddhist group. She had some connection with them, at least spoke with them, and was, and refers to them in some of her books. But she very much is in this what I'm calling meta tradition, and she comes a bit more out of you could say a corporate or collective spirit, but she's very individual. She's very her experiences are the chronicle of her experiences of no self. And I think this is very unusual. When you look at the history of mysticism and you read Bernadette Roberts, or to speak with her, it's very, very different in presentation. But when you look at what she's actually saying, it's very much in continuity, both with figures like Eckart, Meister Eckart, and Jakob Böhme, even though she's not interested in those people at all. And I can say that straight up. She's not interested in Christian theosophy, particularly, and doesn't really acknowledge a lot of connection to it, because she's very much focused on chronicling her own experience, which is she is very she's very certain about that, and so about those, and she very much fits in what we're talking about, right? This kind of American spirit, you could say.
Yes, I think you're right. And there's an odd tension there. I wonder what you think of this. There can be an anti-intellectualism or a refusal to acknowledge influences, or that what one has done is in any way reminiscent of what has been done before, because originality equates to authenticity or veracity. It seems there seems to be a need to be original. I'm not influenced by something from the past. I wouldn't want to make it seem that my experience was somehow scripted by the lineage of mystics. What I'm having is new and unrelated, and I refuse to even look in that direction, lest I sort of muddy my sometimes what is then contradictorily presented as a kind of universal truth applicable to all men. It's this interesting mix of a certainty of the universal application of one's original insight, which has never been seen before. And we see that in nascent form, perhaps in the sorts of attitudes of that you're describing there with figures such as Bernadette Roberts, perhaps, but also taken to its extreme in figures such as Adida.
Yeah, that's true. You know, Adida, Franklin Jones, his original name, Da Friedjan, he had he made claims that were really enormous claims, and he positioned himself to some extent in relation to transcendentalism. I mean, not obviously as a transcendentalist, but simply kind of gesturing in that direction. But the claims that he made were really quite exceptional. Bernadette Roberts, in her case, she is, you're right, pushing aside, earlier, she was not interested in Christian Theosophy or, Eckhart or any precedent. And that's very different than what you see in Buddhist traditions, where in Buddhism, and here I'm primarily referring to Tibetan Buddhism, although it's true also in Zen. I've had some training in Zen. My main training is in Tibetan Buddhism. And it's all about being part of that continuity and not rejecting, it would be quite alien essentially to that tradition to be asserting your own your own unique enlightenment and completely rejecting previous or ignoring or the dynamic is just very, very different. And I allude to that at the end of the book, and at the end of American Gurus, that a lot of what I'm writing about in the book is American phenomena. I mean, it is distinctively American, I would argue. At the same time, when you look at it from the point of view of Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly a tradition like Mahamudra, where there's a very clear sequence, and the sequence of stages. There are different stages, and there's explanations for how you move through the path. That is fundamentally different than what we're talking about. And that, I think, is an important distinction to make. So, it's really interesting, a lot of the phenomena that we're talking about, and interspersed in the middle, you could say, of this kind of trajectory from transcendentalism through to contemporary figures, which include a whole array of different figures. You do have something that we haven't mentioned, which I think is important to at least allude to, and that's the psychedelic, the psychoactive movement, because that is really new. and it still fits within this kind of argument we're making. In fact, it's arguably the exemplar of it, because if you take a psychoactive substance, whether it's LSD or psilocybin, focusing maybe on those two, that is very individualized. And secondly, it is highly immediate. I mean, it's literally immediate, or at least fairly soon. And so how does that fit into all of this is another question, right? Because, but it does fit in the sense that it fits with the argument of individualism and immediate access. And I think that's an important development that to some extent crosses over a little bit with Buddhism, in that you have in the American scene, you could say, some crossover because of the hippie movement, and then also some people who just completely reject psychedelics. I would say that's the majority. And then others that included a little bit, are a little bit open to it. But there's not many of those folks. And so this is all part of a kind of tapestry, which is really the tapestry of American religious life when you're looking at themes of mysticism and spiritual awakening.
Yes. Your writings on the counterculture, in fact, chapter 13 deals specifically with that. Quite interesting indeed. You, in the opening of that chapter, you write, interpretations of the 1960s have tended to fall into two general camps. One group consists in those who trace perceived social ills back to that period, like a colleague who, morosely contemplating the failures of academe, said that one couldn't begin to rebuild the humanities and social sciences until the generation forged in that era had retired. Probably he's right, though one shouldn't be too optimistic. Another group that's a good one. Another group consists in those for whom the 1960s represent the birth of a still incompleted social revolution. And for them, the era is comprehensible chiefly through Marxist interpretive lenses. The former is a pessimistic narrative of social decline and fragmentation. The latter is an optimistic narrative of partially thwarted social progress that nonetheless could be completed one day in the future. What I offer here is a very different interpretation of that era, and in particular of the emergence of what came to be known as the counterculture. And then you go on to begin your line of thinking by defining modernity and looking at that in more detail. Could you comment a little on your view of the counterculture and how it plays into this tapestry?
Sure. Some years ago, a colleague of mine, Morgan Shipley, and I went down to Tennessee, and we went down to the farm. The farm was one of many collectives that developed in the 70s, largely in the 70s, some in the late 60s, but more in the early 70s, I think. And so we visited Stephen Gaskin. And Stephen Gaskin, we interviewed him and published the interview in a journal called Journal for the Study of Radicalism. And Stephen Gaskin was a charismatic figure who, out in California, gathered a following, quite a large following, giving these kind of extemporaneous speeches, about extemporaneous talks. And they drew together a number of the themes. I mean, he was perfectly well aware of, he taught at a college level, and he was aware certainly of the transcendentalists and a number of the figures that and ideas that I discuss in this book. And he exemplified them. And he said that and I think he said this, well, I know he said this in the interview, that what he does is look at religions and literature more or less like though looking at those punch cards that were used for computers during that period. And you can see there are these holes where the light comes through, and it comes through all the cards, right? That's what he focused on. That was his metaphor, one of his metaphors for that. And so he is kind of an exemplar, actually, of immediatism. He was very charming. He died a few years ago, and he was a very charming fellow, and very, very humble, and very kind. He is perhaps unique, certainly unusual among charismatic figures, in that he was a spiritual teacher. He was head of this community. He brought this extraordinary community of together by going around the United States with all of these buses on this bus tour of the United States. I mean, the kind of thing, in the 1960s and 70s, that this was one of the more remarkable events. Traveling around the United States, all of these hippies in buses, occasionally stopping, and then Gaskin would do some, extemporaneous, teaching. And they finally end up in Tennessee. They create this community there, this kind of farm community. And then Gaskin, ultimately, people say, well, you're too, it's too kind of guru-centric. And so there was kind of a, you could say, rebellion, or a kind of rebellion against. And so he stepped down, and he and his wife went to live in, in a different place on the same grounds, and he stayed there. And it was still part of the community, still, and so that's an unusual phenomenon within the guru. It's usually in the kind of guru chronicles, you could say. There are other examples, but they're not quite like that. And so we met him on the farm. We sat and talked. He was wearing this tie-dyed T-shirt, and he also included psychedelics early on, and then rejected LSD later. So the group rejected it largely at least. They never rejected cannabis. Cannabis he included kind of in his daily, you could say, life, and the group as well, as I understand it. And so he exemplifies the counterculture to me. And so I write about him, but I think he's instructive as a case study in what I'm calling counterculture, because he was a spiritual teacher of immediatism. No question about that. So that's what I was referring to.
You mentioned also a sense of political implications, or at least societal overhaul implications. I suppose that's political, almost by definition in a way. I was recently rereading Imitation of Christ, Thomas A. Kempis, 14th century to 15th century Christian writer. And some of what struck me about that text, some of it, even just reading through the table of contents, the chapter headings, or the section headings really, is so many similarities to, say, the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva, for example. In fact, with a few linguistic tweaks, you could easily credit Imitation of Christ, large parts of it, to a similar author of a text, Tokme Zampo, Shantideva, or something like that, I think could easily be credited, and vice versa. One thing that doesn't seem to be present in Imitations of Christ, for example, or 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva, is the implication of social revolution, social change. In fact, there's a theme of rejecting, at least in terms of where one takes refuge, or where one places one's faith, or where one stores one's treasure, you pick your analogy, there's a theme of rejecting the, if you want, worldly affairs or the happiness of samsara. And now I'm kind of bridging both as I'm saying this, and it kind of taking solace or refuge or placing one's treasures in the inner life as the sustaining and ultimately more worthwhile place. And it also seems that Emerson doesn't seem to be so socially revolutionary either. Doesn't necessarily immediately leap to sort of political overhaul. Maybe I'm wrong about that part. But by the time we get to the so I'm right about that.
You're right.
Okay, good. By the time we get to the 60s, however, there's quite a strong, as you point out, at least in some cases, political element. Quite a confidence, in fact, in a need to overhaul society or remake it. In fact, that seems to be very crucial to many thinkers. The one example that comes to mind is your reference of Ginsberg, Allen Ginsberg, keen to make San Francisco a kind of, what was it, eclectic Tibet, something like that, he said. I'm wondering about that part, because that, I think, is a interesting element that we also see today, a kind of political, there's an assumption of certain political stances that I seem to be hand in glove with American religious movements, including American Christianity. I think people will know that, but also very strongly American Buddhism, and very differently, actually. American Buddhism has a very different political slant than, say, American Christianity does, I think. So I'm wondering, how do you think that came to be? And do you have any comments on its implications?
Well, what I would say is quite a few years ago now, a colleague and I invited in a speaker from the 60s, and that was Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers was a member of the Weather movement and the Weather Underground, and very much a force for revolution, for overthrowing the U.S. government. I mean, for really radical social change. And in memoirs that were published later by the group, you know, they discuss their vision. And so we pulled together some graduate students and interviewed him, did an interview, right? And in the interview, one of the questions that came up was, at one point you said that a good portion of Americans would have to be killed in order to realize the revolution. And it was a significant number. And it was I believe it was a percentage of the population that would have to be killed. And and so he was very, very experienced at answering questions, extremely good. And so he answered it without answering it. He deflected it. He was phenomenal. I mean, he was actually interviewed by a student reporter, and his ability to deflect questions was one of the best. I mean, he's phenomenal at it. He had a lifetime of deflecting the hard questions. Well, what is the hard question here? I mean, this is going back to that same period. And the hard question here is, what did you envision? And this was one of the questions that he was asked. What did you envision the United States would look like? What would it look like under this, right? He couldn't answer it. I mean, it was not an answerable question, because the violence, the anger, the implied violence, the anger, and in some cases real violence, bombings and so forth, and the overthrow and the anger was dominant, and the thinking about the after, not so dominant, right? And so the reason that I mention this is that that mentality from that conversation, which you see in that conversation with Bill Ayers, is not very much in sync with what I would call American, what I see in American Buddhism or in Christianity. In other words, I don't see anyone out there who, that I'm aware of, who is endorsing this kind of violent overthrow and destruction and anger and so on. And yet there is a continuity, right? There's a direct line between what Bill Ayers and the Weather folks were doing back in the late 60s, early 70s, when they ultimately were on the run and hunted by the FBI. And then somehow mysteriously, nobody ever went to got any serious time or anything. That's one of the great mysteries of that period. But anyway, let's ignore that and just look at the line. What is the line? Well, the line goes straight from that on the far left all the way up to the present. In the, 2020, you had all the violence and riots and social movement, and there's a lineage there's a lineage there which is continuous on the far left. And the thing that I would say about that, and I would just remark on it, that I've kind of scratched my head, is that it has there are a lot of parallels between that and the Bolshevik Revolution, or before that, the French Revolution, or after that, the Chinese Revolution. These things are all connected. And the reason I'm kind of scratching my head, and that's what I was mentioning, is when I know that there are many Buddhists who identify with the left in American Buddhism. But I think it's important to recognize that the far left has a history which you can see in terms of Buddhism very clearly in China. And the Chinese invasion of Tibet, the documentation of that, the photographic documentation that you can look at in books like Forbidden Memories, which is a photographic documentation of really horrific things that happened in Tibet as Buddhism was destroyed under a movement driven by the far left. Okay, so it is something that I think people need to reflect on. And I realize this is awkward. It is sometimes, in my calling, as I feel it, to say these things. And so American Christianity is not so, it is divided. There are many different groups. I have neighbors who, I know people who who are deeply Christian, and because their pastor has become very, very much enamored with the left, then their group becomes left. The community, to some extent, within that church. Then there are very, very conservative Christians who thoroughly reject, or the word may not be conservative. I think there now has been a development which is people who are Christian and nationalist and reject what they call rhinos, Republicans in name only, and even reject the term conservative. That's why I tend to use the terms right and left. I realize some people hate those terms. They come from the French Revolution. And since what we're talking about directly comes from the French Revolution, I think they're probably the most appropriate terms. I think we could have a political structure that had nothing to do with those terms, but that would be a different conversation. We're talking about what's happening now and kind of this broader lineage. So I think those are the things I would say, about American Buddhism and American Christianity.
That's very interesting. You make a point in the early parts of the book about primary and secondary religions. The key differentiation being that secondary religions are reactive, or position themselves or define themselves in opposition to. They're defined by what they're not as much as what they are. I was reflecting on this point as I was reading your book, and I was wondering where this tremendous confidence comes from in these figures, particularly these spiritual countercultural figures in the 60s, in their tremendous zeal to overturn or incite revolution or deconstruction of some sort. Another thing you point out is the absorbing of wisdom traditions, not only Western wisdom traditions, but also Eastern, Asian Western traditions, and a kind of recasting some of the terms, such as no self, such as emptiness, and so on, recasting it with this tremendous confidence, reinventing or repopulating of a view. I'm just staggered in a sense where the confidence comes from.
Well, there are a few examples that I give in the book American Gurus about of people who had gone to India for a couple of weeks, maybe, met a guru, and came back and I'm a guru. And really you have to, it is something remarkable, because how do you really claim that? It doesn't always produce great results, I don't think, when you're looking at the kind of the total trajectory. In the case of somebody like Stephen Gaskin, he was essentially very much like in the Emersonian tradition, in that he was confident in the way Emerson was confident. Emerson writes these consecutive sentences that are just very, very certain, and in a certain sense also very pure, in terms of advice, in terms of how to live. Where does this come from? I don't know. Comes out of his direct intuition, really. I mean, he just opened up and wrote. Gaskin did the same thing. He would gather together his 500 hippies, and he would discourse and go back and forth with people, and it was really quite extraordinary when you look at it. At the same time, I think you're right about psychedelics playing a role in some of the things we're talking about. Gaskin certainly, others as well, but it doesn't play a role, I don't think, at all in a number of the guru figures. There, it's somebody has either an experience or a set of experiences, or makes claims, whatever the case may be, and it starts to take on a inertial force. They start to pull people in, and dynamics of guru disciples start to play out. And there, once somebody is established in that kind of dynamic, then it becomes kind of hard to get out of it. And the ball starts rolling down the hill, and it just keeps gathering speed, but sometimes it just crashes, and it shatters, because circumstances reveal different things, or who knows what. Somebody gets carried away. So that history has has a lot to do often, I think, with particular kinds of social dynamics. Also, there are phenomena. I mean, Adida, during the period when he was, I think it was when he was Da Frijan, there was this period, and I describe it in the book, where there's all this kind of, it's phenomena similar to the descent of the Holy Spirit in Pentecostal communities. He had that kind of phenomena around him. There's something going on. I mean, I'm sure there's something going on there. I mean, there's a whole body of people that all had these experiences. And they said they had the experiences and they all remembered it for the rest of their lives. And so something is really going on there. And so, I don't cast a judgment on that in the book. I don't say, this is this or this is that. And I don't denigrate different teachers or guru figures, but I do describe in a as objective a way as I can from sources and documentation what happened. And so the confidence, to answer your question, in some cases comes from experience. But here's the thing: experience can be deceptive. This is why in Buddhism it's so important in that tradition to have teachers, to have guides. And sometimes you have guides. Some of these did. Some of the guru figures did, but many of them did not. Right? They just kind of spontaneously combusted, you could say. So that, I think, is an important distinction to make. So those are a few remarks kind of extemporaneously about this.
Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer, which I expect you're familiar with, there's a fabulous line in there, something along the lines of the efficacy of a doctrine is not in its accuracy, but in its certitude. Meaning, of course, that it doesn't necessarily have to be true to be potent as a doctrinal force. And you're picking up on this point in social dynamics. And in Ojai, my colleague Michaela, she rescues dogs, right? And there's a dog pack of, I think, currently 6 rescue dogs. And they organize themselves really rather spontaneously into a hierarchy with an alpha dog. And I've witnessed several of the alpha dogs over the years, dying. And then the next one sort of moves up, or the bottom dog, new dog comes in, and the bottom dog's now number 2 from the bottom. And the change in orientation and bearing and personality in some sense is remarkable to watch. There's no reason really why 5 should follow 1. Fundamentally, the 5 should follow the alpha. There's no particular size differential. In fact, the current alpha dog is, I think, one of the smallest of all of them. She's just been there longer. It comes down to that. And it seems a crucial element to the guru. Yes, there's one's personal experience. I've had an experience of enlightenment. Of course, if one's experience of enlightenment points to the shatters the illusion of one's previous view, it seems somewhat incomplete to then take on the new enlightened view with as much tenacity and certainty as one held the previously shattered view. It seems a little short-sighted, but nonetheless, there it is. I've had the experience, and so now I know. But it's a crucial step in the Chronicle of the Guru, as you say, seems to be the devotees. There has to be a pressure from the outside coming back into the Guru saying, you've got it. This is it. This collaboration, it seems, between the guru disciple. Now, I don't know. I think maybe speculating here a lot. Of course, I'm asking you. I'm just framing it in this way. That I think is particularly interesting. You mentioned Adida with the epiphenomena, his charismatic powers, something shared by his direct influences. Rudy, for example, Albert Rudolph, the New York antiques dealer and spiritual teacher. Rudy also had that power that was seen as evidence. So it's, yes, I had the experience, but also I'm able to perform or generate this field of spiritual experience. In fact, you even mentioned Andrew Cohen was that seemed to be one of the turning points for him when some of the ladies in his circle began to have spontaneous experiences, and that was seen as evidence of his enlightenment. And so, do you have any comment about that? I'm curious, where do you think this charisma comes from? And I mean that in the sense of charisma, in the sense of the gift, the gifts of the Spirit. In that sense, we see it in the Pentecostal traditions, and we see it indeed in these new gurus, and we see it, I think, also in meetings in traditional religious contexts. One hears many American converts say, to use your example, Tibetan Buddhism, a sort of love at first sight. They go looking for a guru, they meet this Lama, they meet that, but then they met this one and they knew, they had tingles, they had shocks. There's some sort of experience. These are, of course, similar phenomena that one might experience in the presence of a movie star or a rock star. So I don't know if they're the same, if there's a status element at play, or if there's some other means. Group hypnosis, of course, has been, or indeed raw spiritual power, or maybe even the raw feeling of the certainty of the frame of the guru. Who knows? Have you speculated about where do these phenomena come from? And it seems that no strata of society is safe. From the most educated to the least educated can be affected and converted by this kind of road to Damascus experience. So I'm curious, what have you thought about that?
Well, in the book, I just outline the history of different figures based on documentation and, in some cases, conversations. Primarily, everything in the book is in some way documented, and so that, and in that way, I don't speculate, in the context of the book about interpretations. In other words, I give a history of or examples of some of these phenomena that that we're talking about. But I don't move to the level of hypothesizing and as to cause effect or origin or anything else. I also don't, in the book, I focus primarily really on figures, American figures, either historical or contemporary, who've had these experiences, transcendent experiences, or made claims for that. And those experiences are immediate. They're immediatists. That's the term that I coined for them. But what I don't do is discuss then in the book the history of American Buddhism, for example, or the history of Hinduism, for that matter, or other traditional. Really, what I'm looking at are independent figures, largely. Whether it's psychedelics, somebody takes psychedelics. I mean, there are actually contemporary figures that are almost like evangelists of psychedelics. I don't look at, for example, in the book, Chogyam Trungpa, because he doesn't exemplify this phenomena that I'm discussing. And if I were to discuss him, it would have been in the same way. In other words, I would have looked at him and his, there were some extraordinary things that some of his students have reported. And I have no reason to doubt those things, actually. I have no reason to doubt it whatsoever. So how do you interpret a figure so influential, so extraordinary? I mean, his cultural impact was remarkable. There's just no question about that. You look at Shambhala, the book publisher. You look at Naropa in Colorado. Buddhist College. You look at these figures like Allen Ginsberg and many others that were all part of or related to his impact. So what would I say about a figure like that. I mean, he's controversial in, in some respects. I can't, I pass no judgment and make no effort to, am not willing to speculate about origin of particular phenomena or what's going on here or those kinds of things. But I would say all of these figures are culturally important, whether they are, positive or negative examples. I leave that for other people to, make that assessment. But what I would say is, there is clearly a broad cultural impact that all of these different American guru figures have had when you look at them collectively. And that includes Ken Wilber, that includes, for that matter, Adida or Gaskin, or, so they all have this impact. I think one of the things that's developing now that's quite important, and that relates to this, is centered in the figure of Alan Wallace. Alan Wallace is a Lama, Tibetan Lama, who has put a lot of energy into the study of what he calls contemplative science, and developing, in concert with scientists, a kind of shared, developed understanding of the nature of the mind and the nature of meditative experience, and developing what he calls contemplative observatories. I think all of that and that effort which he's making, and others with him, I think that's vitally important. We're only at the beginning of that kind of effort, and I think it really will shed light on, ultimately, on the questions that you're referring to. So I would point toward that as something I think that's really important, and that ultimately is going to have shed a light on a lot of larger social phenomena, like what we're talking about. Does that make sense? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yes, and you're right. You don't speculate in the book at all. It's not that sort of a book. You're tracing the thread of immediatism as you see it from Emerson and prior, all the way back to Plato. You actually draw some links, but nonetheless, you're showing how that progresses through the 20th century and into today. That's true. So of course, when I ask you to speculate, I'm asking you ex cathedra, outside of the remits of the book. I understand that's the case. And indeed, as a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner and indeed teacher of that religion, that's another hat that you wear, if you like, another role that you have with the Samya Institute and so on. I wonder if in that context you have reckoned with those questions.
Well, in my own case, I do what's helpful within the context of Samye, which is a community of Pakshak Rinpoche. And so I can't say that in that context, it's something that, this collection of things that we're talking about is something that comes up very often, because it's really a tradition focused on Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and specifically movement through that tradition, and through that tradition, which is a sequential tradition. And so, I would say that is what we really focus on. And I kind of go off in different directions in my scholarship, which is I explore things that I enjoy exploring. And in that case, it's not necessarily directly a reflection of Tibetan Buddhist practice, although it's related. Obviously, it's related. And I know I had a friend who I sent a copy. We've been, practitioners for quite a few years. I sent him a copy of American Gurus, and as a gift, and he was scratching his head. He read it, he and his wife, and he said, we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now, and just the questions it raises, the kinds of things that it raises, which are outside the purview of they're kind of outside the pale, almost, as a set of questions. So I laughed. We actually laughed about that together. At the end of American Gurus, what I suggest is really what I'm alluding to here, which is, and I was alluding to with the comment about Ellen Wallace, and that is one of the reasons that I became so deeply connected to the tradition that I am part of, is that it provides this sequential understanding. And for me, because I'm not particularly good as a practitioner, it's really helpful to have that kind of guidance and have that kind of sense of, here's where you're going, and you're not there yet, but something like this is going to happen down the road. That's really important, and to me. And so that would be my response, is that I do go off in heretical directions here and there. A lot of my work is literally about heresy. It's literally about heresy. And I've studied a lot of heretics. And, that's kind of how it is. I've studied a lot of radicals too. At the same time, these are all connected to a center, and the center is practice. So that's what I would say.
Your own personal practice, or
yes.
Yeah.
So that is there in the center, and then these other things are areas that I go off to explore. And I see it as an adventure. It's adventuring. My next book is going to be American Gnosis, and that book is, I will guarantee you, there is a 100% chance when you read that book, there are things in there you will read and you will say, wait, I gotta go for a walk. Because I know some of the chapters that are going to be in there, and you'll be, how do you process this? Like, what,
Can you give us a hint?
I'll leave it at that, because there are some things that I've discovered that are just really fun to explore. I just love to explore things. I really do. And, I'm so fortunate to be able to do it and share it with people. And, having this conversation with you is part of that. And I really appreciate it. It's fun.
Yeah.
And you're an exceptional, an exceptionally, I would say, thoughtful and perceptive and, eloquent, conversationalist. And so I really appreciate, dialogue is very important to me. And I really appreciate the opportunity to go back and forth with you, Steve.
Thank you. The pleasure is mutual, I can assure you. It's a great privilege, in fact. And okay, well, you've proven yourself today to be not only a heretic, but also a tease. So we'll have to look forward to American Gnosis. So, all right, well, perhaps we can finish then with this. This is a little bit outside of the purview of the book, but nonetheless, I'll give it a shot. If we were to switch track somewhat to American Buddhism, and I think I was delighted to see you cited, or you referred to Alan Watts' essay, Beat Zen, Square Zen, which I think is a very good essay. If I could characterize it as saying, one of the things it says is two ways in which American culture interacts with Zen and makes it's a third thing, the beats in the squares. And, to get Freudian again, the thing that's interesting about that book is this idea of, there's this trope in psychology that if you don't work out your childhood issues, you'll play them out in your relationships. Romantic relationships as an adult, unknowingly, and the things we're looking for in our partners sometimes are what we didn't get as children, blah blah blah. This sort of trope, psychological trope, pop psychology trope. Alan Watts, I think, is playing there a little bit. Many of that interaction with Zen, driven by a kind of unresolved home religion dynamic. I think that's fascinating. So Zen, in a way, perhaps because it's earlier, is a more obvious example of the American Buddhist encounter, producing a kind of American Buddhism, an American Zen, and this has been, I think, widely recognized. But I'm curious, you're a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. In what ways do you see, if at all, the mixture or the meeting of the American immediatism and other cultural factors that you describe, and Tibetan Buddhism, for example? I'm wondering if you notice any trends there, or any that are indicative of the same sort of thing that Watts points out in Beat Zen, Square Zen, for example, similar sort of ideas. Or indeed, extending from that perhaps, is there any possibility, seeing as American culture is so influential on the international stage, is there any possibility of that being re-exported back to redefine the tradition in its home contexts? I think, for instance, of the Burmese Vipassana movement, which has been described by some as a sort of reactionary revitalization, almost reinvention, you could say, of Buddhist Vipassana practice in the face of colonial influences. That's one of the strands. I think that's not quite right. It's much more than that. But nonetheless, perhaps that's a force, a factor. So I'm wondering there, those two things really. In what way you see in specific Tibetan Buddhism and American culture interacting in these sorts of ways, and also if there's any evidence of any kind of, if you want, back influence.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reflecting just for a moment there because very early on, I grew interested in Zen and, looked for different Zen teachers and went to Philip Kapleau Center. And I know people who are still connected with it. So I went there, I think once or twice maybe. And Philip Kapleau, of course, had gotten Zen training and then in Japan, and then started a center here. And then among his students was a woman named Toni Packer. And she created a Zen. He was Rinzai, drawing largely on a kind of modified Soto Rinzai. It's a kind of joined lineage to some extent. And but she really, what she developed was really Zen without koans, it was really without the any of the Japanese elements, you could say, or that is the kinds of either language or wearing the rakusu or the all those things, but then also the rejecting basically even like teaching to some extent. And so that's an example of the kind of the spontaneous development of a almost what Jeffrey Kripal calls, non-religion, it's like a non-religious religion or an unreligion or something, which is to some extent an American phenomenon. So that's, that does exist. Not as much in the Tibetan Buddhist sphere, in my observation. I mean, I think Zen has lent itself to some extent, partly by its you could some degree call it iconoclastic, history, especially the Rinzai. Because of that, it lends itself a little bit more to that kind of Americanization. Tibetan Buddhism, not as much, because Tibetan Buddhism typically, in my experience, comes with a lot of cultural and linguistic and religious aspects. And I really value those personally. I mean, I actually find that quite important. In fact, I'd say essential for me. And so I'm actually studying classical Tibetan right now. It's one of the things that I'm engaged in addition to the other things. So from my perspective, personally, to be be able to draw on and understand and be connected to something that goes so far back and has the force of so much behind it, you could say, and embedded in it, is really important. So that's my own experience. But when I look more broadly, of course, there are all kinds of different things happening in American forms of Buddhism. And so it's really hard to make, generalizations. I can talk about my experience, what I've observed. And those are two examples, actually. And I'm not sure that they really speak to entirely what you're asking about, but they do give some indicators.
Perhaps I could put a finer point on it. I'm also, by the way, a student of classical Tibetan, so it's nice to hear that you're studying that. It's quite fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, perhaps I could put a finer point on it, that I've been struck that I don't think this is a tremendous revelation, that some of the behavior, a lot of the behavior and organization of, say, American, if we talk specifically about Tibetan Buddhism, okay, aside from the Lama figure to an extent, very similar, including the publishing houses, including the universities, and so on, very similar to the sort of behavior one sees in, let's say, mainline Christian, specifically Protestant Christian cultural expression. So I'm always surprised. A mental game I sometimes play with myself, on myself, and indeed in observing these things, is I sometimes switch the religion, just, switch the lens and look at the Roshi as a Lama, or look at the Lama as a priest, or look at the student or devotee of Tibetan Buddhism as a Pentecostal or a Baptist or something like that. And I'm surprised to see that the shoe fits rather well on the other foot, so to say. And that's always interesting to me. It's not to say that it's wrong or bad. It's just to say that human beings are doing both activities. So there seems to be some similarities. But also, if we talk about America, American human beings are doing, with their culture, that cultural force, both activities. So that's and one of the criticisms that one sometimes hears from Asian teachers of American students, and there are indeed many criticisms that one hears, is that, Americans, you just want the high teachings. You want Dzogchen, you think you can go straight to the high teachings and so on. And I think, perhaps in your view of, if we take your argument of immediatism, it's natural, actually. Straight, the Protestant immediatism, this whole thread, straight to Dzogchen. Of course. That seems to be, you describe Adida as the avatar of immediatism. I think Dzogchen, from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view, or Mahamudra, can be misinterpreted perhaps, but can be easily seen as the most compatible of all the yanas with this immediatism. So, yeah, I wonder about that. I mean, do you see any immediatism in the American fascination with Dzogchen? Do you see any immediatism at play there?
Well, that's something that I haven't really looked at yet. It's not in American Gurus. It probably will be in this next book. There are some really interesting people out there. For example, Keith Dowman, is, as I understand it, teaching a kind of it's Dzogchen, which is it doesn't have a lot of the kinds of structure around Dzogchen, the kind of preparatory, practices and other things, in the sense of, the 9 yanas, or the preliminary practices, Nundro, that, as I understand it. So there are people who, as I gather, do that to some extent, but I'm not really sure whether that fits with immediatism as such, because there still is, as I understand it, a sequence within that, and that someone like him is still teaching within that, and certainly, with basically a lifetime of working with teachers, and living in Nepal, this is someone who just kind of went in that direction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's disconnected from the tradition itself, I guess is what I would say. But I haven't really explored that enough to, speak with any kind of, clarity about it, because I just haven't done that. I do think you're right that there's a tendency. It's an interesting experiment you suggest. Taking a look at different publishing houses or other enterprises, and just sort of putting on a different tint on your glasses and seeing how it looks. It's kind of an interesting experiment. I do think that, I alluded to Pentecostal kind of phenomena, and such things do happen. I mean, and you could call it Pentecostal phenomena in Christianity or somewhere else. What does that actually mean, right? Like, what is the significance of that? I mean, I know one scholar who's really a well-known scholar who said, well, one interpretation is, from his family background, is it's demonic, and just straight up demonic. And he said, well, there's no intrinsic reason that it might not be demonic, and this is someone really who's trying to be an objective scholar, right? And just saying, okay, well, that's a hypothesis. I have to accept it as a possible hypothesis, right? And so there's a lot of ways that you can, different like lenses you can put on, and different tints, and you can look at things from different angles, and they all have some validity, I think. And ultimately you come to your more studied conclusions, which draw on all these different sources. And, that's the direction, that I'm taking with these different books. And each book explores something new and something that I think is important. So I really appreciate the chance to talk about these things with you.
Oh, it's been so wonderful, really fascinating, and thank you for being so generous with your time. Professor Arthur Versluis, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate it. This is an opportunity for me to think about these things too, and reflect on them. And as an interlocutor, you're really able to encourage that, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.